My name is Renata Ford. I'm 45 years old. My mother introduced me at a party once with the sentence, "Renata doesn't build things. She just signs paperwork." Everyone laughed. I laughed too. I want you to remember that sentence, because in 11 minutes of this story, it's going to be the only thing standing between my family and losing everything they'd ever built. I didn't argue with her that night. I picked up a tray of empty glasses and started clearing tables, the way I always did at Ford family events. The quiet one, doing the unglamorous work while my brother Chase got toasted like a king. But what she didn't know, standing there with her mimosa and her punchline, was that 4 months later, in front of 200 people, a film crew, and a private equity partner holding a check for $11 million, my family would learn exactly what my signature was worth. If you've ever built something quiet that nobody bothered to understand, if you've ever been the punchline at your own family's table, stay with me to the end, because this one has a moment I promise you won't see coming. Subscribe and drop the word signature in the comments right now before we even start, so I know you're the kind of person who stays for the whole story. I read everyone. Let's go back to where it started. All the way back, because you need the full weight of it to understand why I did what I did. I grew up above a restaurant in Trenton, New Jersey, Ford's Table. A narrow storefront on Hamilton Avenue with red vinyl booths. A bell over the door that my father, Walt, rigged himself out of an old ship's bell he found at a scrapyard, and a cash register that rang like a church bell every time the drawer opened. He opened it the year I turned 6, using every dollar he and my mother had saved, plus a loan from my grandfather that took him 9 years to pay back. I know it took 9 years because there was a ledger. My father kept everything on paper, in longhand, in a series of green accounting books he bought a case of at once because he liked the way the covers felt. My brother Chase is 4 years older than me. From the moment he could reach the grill standing on a milk crate, he was the heir apparent, and everybody in that restaurant knew it before he did. He had my father's laugh. Big, sudden, contagious. And my father's way of remembering a regular's order before they sat down. Mrs. Alvarez, table 6, no onions. Officer Denny, counter seat, extra bacon, on the house on Fridays because Walt believed in taking care of the people who took care of the neighborhood. Chase absorbed all of it like it was written into him at birth. He was built for the front of the house, the handshakes, the deciding. I was built for somewhere else. I did my homework at the end of the counter on a stool that wobbled if you leaned left, and I noticed things nobody else in that restaurant noticed, because nobody else was looking for them. I noticed that our menu said Ford's Table Registered Trademark, with a little trademark symbol, years before anybody had filed anything with anyone. I noticed that the walk-in cooler's compressor cycled on exactly 4 minutes before it should have, which meant the seal was going, which I mentioned to my father when I was 11, and he laughed and said I should have been born a boy so I could take over the kitchen someday. He meant it as a compliment. I understood, even then, that it wasn't one. There's a specific memory I go back to more than any other from that period. I was 9. I'd entered the regional science fair with a project on food safety. Bacterial growth rates at different refrigeration temperatures, something I'd built using 3 mini fridges my father let me borrow from the restaurant's storage room. I won second place in the entire county. My father found out about it from another parent at pickup, 3 days after the fact, because the night of the fair, Chase had a Little League playoff game, and that's where everyone went. My mother did apologize, sort of. She said, "Well, honey, you'll have plenty more science fairs." I didn't. I never entered another one. Some part of 9-year-old me understood, with a clarity I wouldn't have been able to put into words yet, that I was allowed to be good at things as long as being good at them didn't require anyone to show up. That's the floor plan of my childhood. Chase got the audience. I got a stool at the end of the counter and a very early, very thorough education in doing excellent work that nobody watched. By the time I was in high school, Ford's Table had a second location, and my father had started talking about Chase, taking it over one day the way other fathers talk about their kid making varsity. I applied to college for pre-law, and I remember the exact dinner where I told them. My mother set down her fork and said, "Pre-law? Ren, what does that even mean, practically?" My father, to his credit, at least asked a follow-up question. "You want to be like one of those lawyers on TV?" Before Chase interrupted to say the fryer at the second location had died, and did Dad have a guy who could look at it before the weekend rush? The conversation moved on. It always moved on. I got into a state school 200 miles away on a partial scholarship I supplemented with work study and a part-time job at the campus law library, which is where I discovered I had a genuine, specific talent. Not for arguing, which is what most people assume lawyers do, but for reading. For finding the sentence buried on page 40 of a filing that changed the meaning of everything on pages 1 through 39. My contracts professor, a sharp, tired woman named Dr. Okafor, pulled me aside after my first year moot court and told me I had a forensic mind, which she meant as the highest compliment she gave, and which I wrote down in a notebook because nobody in my family had ever used a word like that about anything I did. I graduated, went straight into a joint JD program, and specialized. Deliberately, almost defiantly, in something so unglamorous that people's eyes would visibly glaze at parties when I described it: intellectual property and business formation law, trademarks, entity structuring, the boring scaffolding that holds a business up long after everyone's forgotten it's there. I liked it precisely because it was invisible work. I understood invisible work. I'd been doing it my whole life. My family's reaction was consistent across every milestone. When I got into law school, "But what will you actually do with that?" from my mother at dinner in front of Chase's then-girlfriend. When I passed the bar exam on my first attempt, something roughly a third of people don't manage, my father said, "Good, good," and then asked Chase how the new friar was working out, the second friar of my life to apparently matter more than a licensing exam. When I made junior associate at a downtown firm, nobody asked what that meant. When I made partner, 7 years later, at 36, younger than almost anyone else in the firm's history, my mother's response, delivered over the phone while I could hear a television in the background, was, "That's nice, sweetheart. Did you hear Chase is opening a fourth location? I want to be fair to my family here, the way I've tried to be fair through this whole story." They weren't cruel in the dramatic sense. Nobody screamed. Nobody threw anything. This was a quieter erosion, the kind where you slowly learn that your accomplishments require translation to even register, and eventually you stop offering the translation because it's exhausting to keep explaining why something mattered to people who've already decided it doesn't. Here's the moment that actually built the foundation of everything that came later, and it happened when I was 26, in my third year of law school. On a Tuesday night, I remember specifically because I was eating cold pad thai out of the container when my phone rang. It was my father. One of maybe 5 times a year he called me directly, and always for a reason. "Ren," he said, over the clatter of the restaurant behind him. "Quick thing. Chase wants to put the logo on merchandise. Hats, aprons, that kind of thing. And someplace over in Allentown is using something that looks awfully close to our fork and flame mark. You're doing all that law stuff anyway. Can you look into it?" I looked into it. Properly. The way I do everything. And what I found stopped me cold. Ford's Table had been operating for 19 years at that point with 0 trademark protection. No federal registration. No state registration. Nothing. Anyone, including the place in Allentown, could have taken the name outright, could have taken the fork and flame logo my father sketched on a napkin in 1987, and there would have been almost nothing my family could have done about it. My father had built nearly 2 decades of his life's work on a foundation that, legally, barely existed. So I filed it. Federal registration, word mark, and design mark both, done exactly right, the whole thing. A process that took me 4 months of unpaid work squeezed between torts and contracts, using filing fees I paid myself out of a work-study paycheck because nobody offered to reimburse me, and I didn't want to have the conversation of asking. I was proud of it. I remember printing the confirmation and driving it home to show my father, and he glanced at it for maybe 4 seconds and said, "Great, thanks, Ren," before going back to a supplier invoice. I told myself that was fine. I told myself the point wasn't the thank you. Mostly, I believed that. Here's the detail that matters more than any other in this entire story, so I need you to really hear it. When you file a federal trademark, someone has to be listed as the legal owner, the applicant of record. Ford's Table wasn't incorporated yet at that point. It was still a sole proprietorship, informal, all handshake and habit, the way small family restaurants often run for years before anyone forces the paperwork. I asked my father, over the phone, mid-dinner rush, distracted, what entity he wanted listed as the owner. "Just put it under whatever's easiest, Ren," he said. "You know this stuff better than I do." Whatever's easiest. I want you to hold on to that phrase because it becomes the hinge this entire story swings on, 18 years later. There wasn't a clean entity to put it under yet, so I did what any first-year trademark attorney is trained to do in that exact situation. I filed it under a holding company I'd set up as a class project that had, almost by accident, become a real, functioning legal entity. R. Ford Holdings, LLC. Standard practice. The kind of placeholder structure you use to protect a client's mark today rather than waiting 6 months for them to get their corporate paperwork in order. I always intended it to be temporary. I sent 2 separate emails over the following years. Once when Chase opened the second location, once when my father finally incorporated the business properly in 2007, gently suggesting we clean up the ownership and transfer the mark into the new corporate entity where it belonged. Nobody ever answered either email. The restaurant kept growing. The Fork and Flame logo kept appearing. On menus, on hats, on delivery bags, eventually on the awnings of 4 separate storefronts across 2 counties. And the paperwork just sat there, in my file cabinet, under my name, quietly, for 18 years. Whatever's easiest. That's exactly what it had been, the whole time. Easiest for everyone in my family to forget about, except me, because I was the one who'd actually done the reading. I don't want to rush through those 18 years, because they're the actual substance of this story. Not a montage, but a long accumulation, the way real hurt usually is. There was the year I got engaged to a man named David, a structural engineer I met through a mutual friend, kind and steady and entirely unbothered by the fact that I preferred reading case law to going out on weekends. My mother's first question, when I told her, wasn't about David. It was, does this mean you'll finally slow down with the law thing and think about starting a family? The engagement lasted 2 years. David and I are still close. He was at my law firm holiday party last year, actually, which is its own story. But we called it off, mutually. And my mother's reaction to that was somehow more painful than her reaction to the engagement itself. Relief, thinly disguised as sympathy. Well, sweetheart, maybe now you can focus on what really matters. What really matters, in my mother's vocabulary, never once meant my career. There was the year I won a trademark infringement case for a small local brewery against a much larger national chain that had ripped off their logo wholesale. A case that made the Regional Business Journal, with my photo in it, captioned Attorney Renata Ford secures landmark ruling for local business. I brought the clipping to Thanksgiving. My father glanced at it for the same 4 seconds he'd given the trademark registration all those years before, said, "That's great, Ren," and then stood up to toast Chase's 4th restaurant opening, his hand on Chase's shoulder, the exact gesture I'd watch him make at every single major family gathering for the next decade. "To the future of this family," he said. I sat there with a framed newspaper clipping in my lap and passed the rolls. There was the year my grandmother, my father's mother, the one person in that family who'd always treated me like I mattered exactly as much as Chase did, got sick, and I was the one who drove up every weekend to sit with her because Chase was slammed with the 3rd location's opening, and my mother said hospitals made her too anxious to be useful. I was also, quietly, the one who reviewed my grandmother's estate paperwork and caught an error in her will that would have accidentally disinherited her second husband's grandchildren. A mistake nobody else in the family even knew to look for. I fixed it. Nobody ever thanked me for that either, mostly because nobody in the family ever found out. I didn't tell them. By then, I'd stopped expecting the telling to matter. There was the year. And this one I think about the most, when Chase actually did come to me for help, quietly, off to the side at a cousin's wedding, because a supplier was threatening legal action over a contract dispute at the second location. I spent an entire weekend, unpaid, reviewing the contract, drafting a response, and getting the threat dropped entirely within 8 days. Chase thanked me. Genuinely, warmly, the way he thanked people, with a hand on the shoulder and real gratitude in his voice. And then, at Christmas that same year, when my mother asked what everyone was working on, Chase described the whole ordeal in detail. The supplier, the threat, the resolution, and never once mentioned my name. "I handled it," he said. "Took some doing, but I handled it." I sat there and watched my own work get absorbed into somebody else's story in real time, and I didn't correct him. I told myself it didn't matter. I was getting very good at telling myself things didn't matter. I want to be honest about something, because I've promised you honesty this whole story. I wasn't a martyr about any of this. I built a genuinely good life. I made partner. I bought a condo I loved, filled with exactly the furniture I wanted. Nobody else's taste involved. I had David, and after David, I had a small, tight circle of friends from the firm who understood what I did and respected it, which was, I eventually realized, its own kind of family. One that had simply never required a blood test. But there was always a low hum underneath all of it, a specific, familiar ache that showed up every single Thanksgiving when my father raised his glass. Every single time my mother introduced me at a party as the one who just signs paperwork. Every single year that same 2% sat forgotten in a filing cabinet, worth nothing, meaning nothing, waiting. 4 months ago, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, I was at my desk reviewing a licensing agreement when my phone rang. An unfamiliar number, Chicago area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. I get a fair number of cold calls from vendors trying to sell case management software. But something made me pick up. Miss Ford? My name is Marcus Whitfield. I'm outside counsel doing due diligence work for Beacon Hospitality Partners. His voice had the careful, over-polite tone of someone about to deliver news they weren't sure how to frame. We're finalizing an acquisition of Ford's Table Restaurant Group, and I'm calling because our cap table review turned up something I need to confirm directly with you. I set my pen down. Go ahead. Our records show a 2% membership interest in Ford's Table Restaurant Group, LLC, held by an individual named Renata Ford. Are you able to confirm your relationship to that interest? I sat very still. Outside my office window, I could hear the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday. Traffic, a delivery truck idling, somebody's ringtone 2 offices down. I'm his daughter, I said. Walt Ford's daughter. There was a pause, long enough that I could hear him typing something. Then I need to be very direct with you, Miss Ford, because this is a significant issue. Under the LLC's operating agreement, this transaction requires 100% member consent to close, not majority. Unanimous. Your 2% interest, however it came to exist, means this deal. $11 million, 60 employees, 4 locations. Legally cannot close without your signature. We're scheduled to sign in 11 days. Has anyone from your family discussed this with you? No, I said. Nobody has. Another pause. Shorter this time. I have to be honest, this is somewhat unusual. Most sellers know exactly who their members are before we're this deep into diligence. I'd encourage you to speak with independent counsel of your own before this moves any further. I told him I appreciated the call. I told him I'd be in touch. And then I sat in my office for close to 20 minutes without moving, feeling something I want to be honest with you about, because I promised honesty at the start of this story. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was something closer to vertigo. The specific, dizzying sensation of an entire structure you'd assumed was solid revealing, all at once, that it had actually been built on top of you the whole time, and nobody had bothered to check. If you're the kind of person who's ever discovered you were quietly holding up something much bigger than anyone told you, drop the word signature in the comments right now. Because that phone call is the hinge this whole story turns on, and I want to know how many of you recognize the exact feeling I felt sitting in that office. I didn't call my family that night. I want to walk you through exactly what I did instead, because I think it matters. It's the difference between a person acting out of impulse and a person acting out of 30 years of quiet preparation she didn't even know she'd been doing. The first thing I did was call my own outside counsel, a colleague named Priya Okonkwo-Reyes, a corporate attorney I trusted completely, specifically because she owed my family nothing and had no stake in keeping the peace. She pulled the operating agreement, confirmed everything Marcus had told me, and then asked me a question that I've thought about every day since. Renata, she said, before we talk about leverage, what do you actually want out of this? Because those are 2 very different conversations, and I want to make sure we're having the right one. I sat with that question for 2 full days before I had an answer. Not what I could get, what I wanted. And what I landed on, eventually, was smaller than most people would expect. And I think that surprised even Priya. I didn't want to blow up the deal. I didn't want to bankrupt my brother or humiliate my parents into ruin. 60 employees. Line cooks, servers, a dishwasher named Tomas who'd worked at the original Hamilton Avenue location since before I could legally drive. None of them had done anything to me. I wasn't going to make them collateral damage in a 30-year family grievance. What I wanted was smaller and, I think, harder to give. I wanted, for the first time in my life, to be dealt with honestly. Not managed. Not handled quietly off to the side. Dealt with the way you deal with someone whose signature you actually need. The calls started on day 3. My mother first, breezy, the way she always was when she wanted something and hadn't yet decided I was a problem. Renata, sweetheart, there's some silly paperwork thing with the restaurant sale. Your father's lawyer's going to send you something. It's just a formality, nothing to worry about. Formality. That word again, the same one that had been quietly erasing my work for 18 years, now being deployed against an $11 million deal. Chase called an hour later, and I could hear something in his voice I'd genuinely never heard from him before. Not warmth wearing panic, but panic wearing warmth, thin and stretched over something real underneath. Ren, hey, listen, I don't fully understand what's going on with the paperwork side. That's never been my thing, but this deal is everything. You know that, right? This is Dad's retirement. This is my kids' college funds. You'll sign whatever they send you, right? I told him I'd look at the documents when they arrived. That was all I gave him. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I hung up the phone and didn't feel the familiar ache of having been dismissed. I felt something closer to power, which unsettled me more than I expected it to, because it meant I finally understood how much of my life had been spent without any. Over the following week, my father called twice, and both times he opened with logistics. Have you gotten the paperwork yet, Ren? We're on a tight timeline here. And both times, I noticed, he never once asked how I was doing, or what I thought, or whether I had any actual questions about the 2% that had apparently been sitting under my name for nearly 2 decades. It was, I realized, a perfect, distilled version of the exact dynamic I'd lived inside my entire life. My presence required, my perspective irrelevant. On day 8, my mother tried a different approach. A long, meandering voicemail about family, about legacy, about how your father built this with his bare hands and it would break his heart if something silly got in the way of Chase finally getting his due. Chase finally getting his due. Not once, in that entire 2-minute voicemail, did she mention that the something silly was a signature that legally belonged to me. I let all of it happen without correcting them, without explaining what I knew, without giving them a single piece of information they hadn't already had access to for 18 years if anyone had simply opened the right filing cabinet. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't strategy, not entirely. It was that some part of me, the part that had spent 30 years being told my work didn't count unless it was translated into terms my family could understand, wanted, badly, to see what they'd do with 11 days and no idea I already knew everything. 10 days before the scheduled closing, my mother called with what she framed as an exciting idea. Beacon wanted good press around the acquisition. A hometown restaurant goes national story, the kind that plays well in an investor deck and even better on the local news. My parents decided to throw a celebration at the original Hamilton Avenue location. 200 guests, investors flying in. Longtime staff, some of whom had worked there for over 20 years. A local news anchor and a 2-person camera crew booked to run a segment on the 10 o'clock broadcast. My father would give a speech. Chase would formally announce the sale. It was, my mother said, going to be the perfect way to close this chapter as a family. And then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned the part that told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go if I let it. We'll get your signature handled early, sweetheart, before the guests arrive, so you don't have to worry about any of it. Just come by around 6, sign in the back office, and then you can enjoy the party like everybody else. So you don't have to worry about any of it. 18 years of my work being invisible, and at the single moment it was worth $11 million, the plan was still to keep it invisible. Tucked into a back room, out of frame, so the toast could happen without me standing anywhere near the center of it. I said, okay. I want you to remember that I said, okay, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. I let my mother believe, completely, that I was going to walk quietly into that back office at 6 o'clock and disappear the way I always had. The night of the party, I arrived 40 minutes before the scheduled signing. Ford's table looked the way it only looked a handful of times a year. String lights threaded along the ceiling beams, a banner across the back wall reading 40 Weirs. Unfamily. The booths pushed back to make room for 200 people in cocktail attire, holding champagne flutes that had definitely never been part of the restaurant's normal inventory. A three-piece camera crew was testing lighting near the bar. I recognized the local anchor from the evening news, a woman named Carla Jimenez, running through notes with her producer. My father found me near the coat check, already flushed from an early glass of champagne, warm and expansive, the way he always got at these things. "There she is," he said, hand already reaching for my elbow to steer me. "Ren, come on. They're set up in the back for you. Let's get this squared away before the speeches start." "Actually," I said, "I'd like to sign it out here." He blinked, genuinely confused, the way you blink at someone who said something in a language you almost, but don't quite, speak. "Out here?" "Ren, we've got 200 people. There's a news crew." "I know," I said. "I'd like to sign it out here. I want to walk you through exactly what happened over the next stretch of minutes, because I've replayed it more times than I can count, and I think every second of it matters." My father, visibly not wanting a scene in front of a camera crew he'd personally invited, made a decision I don't think he fully thought through. He decided the fastest way to smooth this over was to fold it into the toast he was already about to give. He waved Marcus Whitfield over from near the bar, where Marcus had been standing, slightly out of place, holding a club soda and looking like a man who very much understood the stakes of the room he was in. My father called for quiet the way he always did before a toast, a specific two-fingered whistle he'd used at every family event for as long as I could remember. And the room actually quieted, instantly. 40 years of Thanksgivings, having trained an entire extended family and half the neighborhood to listen when Walt Ford raised his glass. Carla Jimenez's camera operator, without needing to be told, swung the lens toward him. "Tonight," my father said, "we celebrate 40 years of Ford's table and the beginning of the next chapter of everything this family built." His hand found Chase's shoulder. The same hand, the same shoulder, the exact gesture I'd watched him make at every major milestone in my brother's life since I was old enough to notice patterns. "This deal is the culmination of everything we worked for." And then he glanced around the room, looking for me, ready to wave me quietly up to a side table to sign while the applause for Chase covered the sound of the pen. I was already walking to the front. "Before we close this," I said, and the entire room actually turned toward me. A genuinely unfamiliar sensation, because in 45 years, I don't think I'd ever once spoken up, unprompted, in that restaurant. I think everyone here should understand exactly what they're celebrating. My mother's smile went rigid in a way I'd only seen once or twice before, both times when something had gone publicly, irreversibly off script. Chase's hand froze around the stem of his champagne glass. "In 2007, I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "When this company was formally incorporated, I was given a 2% membership interest. Not because anyone thought it mattered, because my brother didn't want to deal with the paperwork, and my father said, and I quote, to put it under whatever's easiest. And what was easiest was putting it under my name, because I liked that kind of thing. For 18 years, that 2% sat in a filing cabinet, forgotten by everyone except me. I was told, in this exact restaurant, at parties very much like this one, that I don't build things. I just sign paperwork. You could hear the room's attention shift, physically, the way a crowd's weight moves when something real starts happening. Glasses stopped clinking. Carla Jimenez's producer had quietly, subtly, angled to make sure the boom mic was catching every word. "Tonight," I said, "that same 2%. The paperwork nobody thought mattered is the only thing standing between this family and an $11 million acquisition. The operating agreement requires 100% member consent to close, not majority, unanimous. Which means, as of right now, nothing in this room happens without my signature." My mother said my name. Low, sharp, the exact warning tone she used to use across a dinner table when I was 14 and had said something true at precisely the wrong moment. I didn't stop. "I'm not here to burn this down," I said, and I meant it. And I think the room could tell I meant it, because some of the tension actually eased, just slightly. This restaurant employs 60 people who had absolutely nothing to do with how my family has treated me for the last 30 years, and I'm not going to make them pay for a conversation that's been 30 years overdue. I held up the folder Marcus had handed me a week earlier, the pages still sealed, untouched until this exact moment. So I am going to sign tonight, right here. But I'm going to sign it in this room, in front of everyone, because I am done being handled quietly in a back office while somebody else gets the toast. And before I do that, I'd like my father to finish the sentence he just started. He said this deal is the culmination of everything this family worked for. I'd like him, just this once, to say out loud who's actually in this family. I have never, before or since, experienced a silence like the one that followed. I counted it afterward, going back through the footage. 11 full seconds, which doesn't sound like much until you're standing inside one, in front of 200 people, a news camera, and both your parents. My father looked at me, really looked. Not the 4-second glance he'd given every accomplishment I'd ever handed him, but something slower, something that seemed to actually be searching for an answer instead of a way past the moment. And then he said it, quietly, but the room was so silent it carried to every corner anyway. You, Ren, you've been in this family the whole time. I just never once said it out loud. I don't know if that was enough. I've thought about it a great deal since, and I still don't fully know. But I signed the document standing up, at the bar, in front of 200 people and a camera crew that ran a 90-second segment on the 10 o'clock broadcast that same night, under a headline I still find slightly embarrassing. Family restaurant sale nearly derailed. By the one daughter no one was watching. My mother cried, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't think it was performance. Chase came and stood next to me at the bar while I signed, and he didn't say anything at all, which, from Chase, who has never in his life gone more than 30 seconds without filling a silence, was its own quiet apology. The deal closed on schedule, 6 days later. Everyone got exactly what they were owed under the terms. Chase's payout, my parents, their retirement fully secured. 60 employees kept their jobs under the new ownership group, which had actually been Beacon's plan the whole time, contrary to what my family had quietly feared I might do to punish them. And I didn't take $1 more than my 2% was legitimately worth under Beacon's own independent valuation of the company. $410,000, calculated the same way it would have been for any arm's length member with any stake in any deal like this one. I want to tell you what I did with that money, because I think it matters more than the number itself. I put every dollar of it into a scholarship fund at the community college 2 towns over from where I grew up, specifically for students studying business and IP law. The unglamorous, invisible corner of the profession that nobody claps for, the kind of work that holds up entire businesses without ever once getting a toast. I named it, quietly, after nobody in particular. Just the Quiet Work Fund. It felt right. My mother calls differently now, not transformed. I want to be honest. This isn't a story where 30 years dissolves overnight into something warm and easy. But she asks about my cases now, actual questions, and she waits for the answers instead of steering the conversation back to Chase within 30 seconds. My father kept the news clip from that night. I know because Chase texted me a photo of it a few weeks later, printed out and taped to the inside of the back office door at Ford's table. The same back office I was supposed to disappear into quietly. The same room where, for one night, everything finally got said out loud instead of managed around. I still go to Thanksgiving. I still, most years, end up passing the rolls. But there's a version of the toast now that didn't used to exist. One where, before my father raises his glass to the future of this family, he looks over at me first. It's small. I used to think I needed something bigger than that. I've learned, slowly, that I didn't. Here's what I actually want you to take from this. If you've spent your life doing quiet, unglamorous, invisible work that nobody in your family bothered to understand or ask about, you don't have to burn the whole room down to finally be seen in it. Sometimes all it takes is refusing, once, to let them sign you off to the side, and standing, right in the middle of the room until somebody finally says your name like it belongs there. Comment the word signature one more time if you made it all the way to the end.